Hey guys, John Nymeister here with a video tutorial version of the portrait I posted the other day. So basically, I'm just going to walk you through kind of step by step of this PSD and kind of explain a little bit of the process, but mostly talking about color. So to start off with, obviously this is the drawing phase, and if you want to see it kind of progress from start to finish, you can watch the time-lapse video that's also on my channel. And for this drawing stage, I'm not trying to get too specific with any kind of details or anything. Like you can see, there's no crease and folds and highlights in the eyes or anything. I was basically just trying to get the general landmarks down, just so I'd have a map to kind of paint on top of, because I wanted this process to be very painterly. And if you don't know how to do this stage, getting your drawing right, I would highly recommend you check out Stan Prokopenko's videos. They're free and they're awesome, and they'll teach you everything you need to know. So, moving on, because this video is going to be mostly about color. So after I got the drawing, I moved on to this underpainting stage. I used some gradient maps and oil brushes, which kind of a technical thing, not really that big of a deal. The main point here is I wanted to give myself some value and some color to work on top of. Value, just because I want to establish sort of my overall composition and get that in place. And color, because digital paint actually mixes. You might not think it does, but when you use a brush at a medium opacity, it takes on some of the characteristics of the colors that are underneath it. It's not exactly like paint mixing, but it still does happen. So the reason I put this color in here is because I wanted that warmth to kind of affect the colors I put on top and shine through in a couple places and hopefully ultimately make the painting feel more warm and alive. Plus it's just interesting. It gives the painting a bit of history if you can see the texture underneath the final marks. So moving on from here, the next portion was basically blocking in the major planes and color zones of the face. And this is what I want to talk most about. The main key for this is color relativity. So for this, when you're painting realistic skin tones, the best approach, in my opinion, is using what's called the Zorn palette. And this was the palette used by the painter Anders Zorn, who is amazing, and you should look him up because he's amazing. Basically, this palette, as you can see, is titanium white, cadmium red, yellow ochre, and ivory black. And from those four colors, you can mix everything you would ever see in real skin. So you can see over here on the right, I've mixed this here is the cadmium red, and I've mixed it all the way up with titanium white. And then I also mixed it down with ivory black. I did the same thing with the yellow ochre over here. And then I also mixed the two of them together to get kind of an orange tone. And again, mixing those with white and black. So from that, you can see there's already a lot of color possibilities in here, but then you can also mix those tones with any gray value, because you have black and white, you have access to every value of gray. So not only do you have yellow from black to white, red from black to white, and orange from black to white, you also have all of these colors mixed with gray. So you really have a pretty wide range of possibilities with just four colors, which is awesome. And the reason gray is important in this palette is because skin tones are all about grays, believe it or not. To make realistic skin, obviously, at least when we're talking about Caucasian skin, it's sort of a desaturated orangish tone. But there's also blues and greens and reds and purples and everything else. But the key to that is they're not like blues and greens and purples. That's a terrible purple. And purples. What they actually are is relative blues, greens, purples, etc. And the way that works is basically when you have one color next to another color, the relationship between those two colors changes what it appears like. So when I have this bright orange blob here and I put a block of gray in it, it looks kind of cold, kind of pinkish almost. But if I take, say, a blue and I put the exact same gray in there, it looks warmer, almost orange. We've seen this optical illusion a million times. There's like the chessboard with the shadow on it and things like that. But this is actually a really useful concept, especially when painting skin, because actual bright, vibrant blues, if you put it on skin, will look like he's wearing war paint or something and not like changing in skin tones. So, to demonstrate this, I mixed up some colors with my fake oils here, and I'll start with this one. So this was this orange up here. So I took my yellow and my red, mixed them together. I added a little bit more yellow, and I also grayed it down. And this resulting color, if you see here on my color picker, is actually a desaturated orangish yellow. It's a very weird looking color. It's probably not a color you'd choose for skin, but you'll notice it is exactly the same as the bluish green tone of his beard. And the reason it looks bluish green, even though it's actually orange, is because it is right next to all these much more vibrant orange and red tones. And so relative to those, it looks much more green. And another way to demonstrate this is simply with your color wheel. This is a very quick and terrible color wheel. We have our complementary colors across from each other. And in the middle of all those is gray. And so if you take an orange and you make it more gray, you see it's moving towards the center of the color palette. And it's also moving towards blue, which is its complement. If you take yellow, move it towards gray, it starts turning more purple. Red starts turning more green. Now, this isn't exactly how it works when you're painting skin because it has to do with all the colors that are around it. But the point is, when you take a warm color and move it towards gray, you're moving it towards cool. So it will appear cooler next to warmer colors. So just for demonstration's sake, I did this a couple more times. I took sort of the light yellow ochre, and the light orange, and I mixed those together. And that is the highlights on his forehead. Same 4 colors. This bright yellow is made of the same 4 colors as this dark green. They're just different values and saturations. Did the same thing over here. This one is just the orange and the black. And that is the color of the shadows on his nose and under his eyes and things like that. Then this one, I took sort of a medium range red and I mixed it with a gray of the same value, and the resulting, quote, purples are the tones in his lips. And obviously there's a bunch of them. Some of them are more red, some of them are more gray, but the combination of them, we get this whole intricate palette of warms and cools, reds, yellows, oranges, greens, blues, purples, and pinks. And they're all in the orange spectrum in just varying values and saturations. So, enough rambling on that. let's move on. Hopefully that made sense. If it didn't, feel free to ask any questions. All right, so after this, I established my rim light just to kind of show the planes on that side of the face, which I won't take too much time. And then I started rendering the features. And I want to point out, since this video is mostly about color, just some of the colors that were involved. So right here under his eye is a really good example. So we have our normal sort of yellowish orange skin tones, but then we also have a green right here and a red right here and more of a pinkish red right here and more of a purple right there and then a green right there and then sort of a deep reddish purple there. This is kind of a neutral grayish, kind of blue, but not exactly. And so you can see there's all these different colors just in this one area underneath his eye. And that right there is the key to realistic skin tones. And if you look at this, start observing people in life and in photographs and all that stuff, it is actually there. It's not, it's not exaggerating for art's sake. These subtle color changes actually do exist in the face. And if you practice observing them, then those subtleties will become much more apparent to you. And that is what makes realistic skin tones, because the realism comes from the complexity of the colors that are kind of moving and changing across the face. And there's a variety of factors that can contribute to this. Like we have in the cheek area, it's much more green. And that's not because of shadow, it's because he has stubble that's overlaid across that section of his face. And so it makes that area appear more green, not because of shadow, but because of texture. And then say here in his philtrum, it's actually a lot more red, not because there's something red there, but because there's light entering right here and subsurface scattering is affecting that. And that's technical terminology I don't have time to get into now, but the point is study your light and facial structure, textures, materials, all these things, and understand that there's a lot of different things affecting the surface at the same time. And when you can recognize and apply all those, then your stuff is going to start feeling realistic. And one last thing on this stage, I did change the rim light from the reference. It was sort of a cool gray in the reference, and I made it more of a green. And an important change I had to make for that to work was I needed a transition tone into his skin, which ended up being this sort of neutral orangish yellow. And basically, it's pretty simple. I have a green rim light, and I need to get to these reddish orange skin tones. So basically, I just needed a transition color, which ended up being kind of a neutral orange. Again, that's a subsurface scattering thing, and it's light affecting underneath the surface, which is something you can study on your own time. Moving on, right here in his neck is a very, I would call it blue and pink color. And as you can see in the color picker, again, it's just a neutral orange. And this is ambient light from the background around him. He was photographed in a gray room, so light is bouncing all around in here and casting this cool gray/blue light filling that area. And again, that's just understanding the properties of light and the properties of skin. And when you apply all these different things, it's going to start feeling more realistic. Here I'm starting to refine his hair, which you'll see is also all in the Zorn palette. If I grab my color picker here, it's all just desaturated reds and oranges and yellows, even these gray, I would call them blue highlights. It's just a really desaturated yellow. Moving on some more, a little bit of texture for the stubble. Same thing there. That's kind of a desaturated yellowish orange. Here's a good point on this particular stage. So I'm refining the jacket, And an important point here is these black areas are not actually black. If I eyedrop them, open up my color picker again, you'll see it's actually a very saturated red at about 10% value. And that's just somewhat a style thing, but it's also kind of a real thing in that pure black almost never happens, and it looks like an empty void, because that's the only time it really does happen is in space where there is no light. Or I guess if you're in a room where there is absolutely no light. But in this situation, we have light all around, bouncing around the room, so I didn't want to use a pure black, even though this is a really dark area. And also, on top of that, you can see here, this is some of that digital paint mixing I was talking about. So if I take this black color, and then I mix the gray of the light on top of it at low opacity, you can see there's kind of these more saturated in-between tones as they move from one to the other. Whereas if I use an actual, this is pure actual black, and I take that same color, you can see those tones don't appear. It's just gray to gray to gray to gray to black. Whereas in this one, there's this nice reddish orange transition tone that really brings a lot of life to this area of the painting. So my recommendation, do not use black, at least not pure black, except in maybe one or two very tiny accents like pupils or a really tight occlusion shadow. Moving on again, I added in his zipper. What I like to do with details like this is basically work on one property at a time. So one property is the shape. I have, do a little brighter. So I have these little nooks, and these are the shape. And this is what I want to establish first. So now I have a silhouette. I'm going to lock the layer, and I'm going to work on another property, which is the side planes and the top planes. So I've locked my layer, and now I can sort of render those and now it's starting to feel a little bit more realistic. But then this zipper is also kind of twisting and turning through space, and it's in shadow from his jacket in certain points. So then I'll lock the layer again and render sort of its overall form. So whenever you have lots of little nitpicky details like that, I usually recommend that kind of process. Work on one thing at a time, get the shape right, get the form of the object itself rendered, and then render an overall form if it's sort of moving and transitioning through space and over time. On to the background. So this was an important change. You can see, obviously, I made it more of a neutral gray like the original reference was. I originally wanted to leave this oil painting look just because it looks nice, but that color relativity principle we were talking about earlier also applies in a compositional sense. So because his skin is very desaturated yellows and oranges, next to this extremely saturated orange, his skin looks very cold and gray, which isn't usually what we're going for when we're painting skin. So by flipping that around and making the background gray instead, now his skin looks much more vibrant and saturated and alive, even though we didn't change anything on the skin itself. So something to be aware of when you're painting your background. It's not just this separate entity. The whole painting works together, and it's all about the relationships of one thing to another. Moving on again. This is a little trick I sometimes do if I want to get if I'm having trouble getting a color. So I put these sort of bluish highlights on his cheeks, but I was having a little trouble just selecting the right color. So I'll usually do this not so much when I'm doing studies, but I'll do it in my own work just because it's faster. But if I know I want a blue highlight, I can grab a bright blue tone, use my brush at a low opacity, and then if I eyedrop sort of with those in-between colors, you can see I got this, again, desaturated yellow color. And if I undo that stroke and then paint it on top, you can see I actually get some nice blue, cool tones. So if you're having trouble getting a relative color, you can try this trick by using the actual color at a low opacity, eyedrop the in-between, and see what you get. Again, it's better to do it by hand, but this can be helpful for time's sake and for learning if you're having trouble getting those colors. All right, about to wrap up here. I did a little bit more painting on his stubble. Put in his necklace with the same process as the zipper. Tweaked a few edges. And then at the very end, I put in some effects using a gradient map, which basically, I'll show you. It applies this gradient of color based on value. So all the blacks are replaced with this blue, all the mid grays are replaced with this orange, and all the whites are replaced with this yellow. And obviously it transitions in between. And then what I do with that is I set it to soft light at a very low opacity, like 30%. And that just kind of, I do this on pretty much every painting. It just kind of ties the thing together. In oils, you might do this with a final glaze, like a really light, like super transparent glaze over top of the whole piece. And it just kind of brings everything together. Then on top of that, I did some cheap digital tricks. I did a bit of glow and vignetting and a bit of levels, all for that same thing, just to kind of push the colors and bring the piece together as a whole. And then at the very end, I used a lighten layer because those adjustments made some of his shadows a bit too cold and blue. So just over top of that, I used lighten to kind of bring some warmth back into them. And what lighten does is, it does what the name implies, it only lightens things. It doesn't darken anything. So if I take a mid-gray color, so this is the color I'm using. It is lighter than this gray, but it's darker than the highlights in his cheek. So you can see it'll lighten that, but it does nothing on his cheeks. So that's a nice tool for adding, or a nice blending mode for adding subsurface scattering and just kind of tweaking your values. If an area is getting too contrasty, you can see earlier here, I used a lighten layer over his ear and cheek just because they were getting a little too high contrast and felt a little bit muddy. And then the very last thing I did was add a little bit of blur with a mask. Nothing special. I just kind of wanted to bring some more focus to his face and downplay areas around the edges. So nothing fancy, but that about covers it. Hope that was useful. Again, if you have any questions about color relativity or the Zorn palette or anything else, feel free to leave them as a comment. And thank you for watching. Cheers.